Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. This half hour, we're going to talk about the economic cost of Donald Trump's savage cuts in environmental and clean energy programs. Our guest in this segment is Bob Deans, who's Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob, welcome back to Deadline DC. Before I ask you this question, we're going to play this clip on the tragic flooding in Texas.
Days out from what's forecast to be an above normal hurricane season, scientists across the country are sounding the alarm over critical staffing shortages. Inside the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, officials are scrambling to fill more than 150 critical National Weather Service roles left vacant after sweeping cuts from the Trump administration. Overall, the service has lost 600 of its 4,000 employees since January. 5 former NWS directors calling it their worst nightmare in an open letter earlier this month, predicting understaffing could lead to needless loss of life.
The original forecast that we received on Wednesday from the National Weather Service predicted 3 to 6 inches of rain in the Concho Valley and 4 to 8 inches of rain in the Hill Country. We worked with our own meteorologists to fine-tune that weather statement, and as many of you know, and many of you in broadcast journalism and meteorology, you can go back and look at your own forecast, and the amount of rain that fell in this specific location was never in any of those forecasts.
This rain event sat on top of that and dumped more rain than what was forecasted on both of those forks. When we got the report, it was about 7 feet or so on the South Fork, and within a matter of minutes it was up to 29 feet, and all of that converged at the Guadalupe, and that's where we saw those very quick rise in flood.
But listen, everybody got the forecast from the National Weather Service, right? You all got it. You're all in media. You got that forecast. It did not predict the amount of rain that we saw.
In light of the floods, do you think that the federal government needs to hire back any of the meteorologists who were fired in the last few months?
I wouldn't know that. I really wouldn't. I would think not. This was a thing that happened in seconds. Nobody expected it. Nobody saw it. Very talented people are there, and they didn't see it. It's, I guess they said, once in 100 years. They've never seen anything like this. So I wouldn't, I mean, people are trying to blame the school. They're trying to blame the camp. They're trying to blame. It's just a horrible thing. But no, I wouldn't say that, no.
Are you still planning to phase out FEMA?
Well, FEMA is something we can talk about later, but right now they're busy working, so we'll leave it at that. Go ahead.
That, of course, was from Ana Cabrera at MSNBC, and that, of course, was a president giving his usual weak response to the tragedy. The Hill Country in Texas is where Lyndon Johnson came from. And I imagine Donald Trump, that Lyndon LBJ would be horrified by the tragic cuts in such important federal programs like the National Weather Service. Our guest in this half hour again is Bob Deans, who is Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob, the reason I wanted to play that clip is we're going to have, because of the president's indifference to climate change, more disasters like that. And the federal government, because of the president's cuts, are going to have less ability to respond to these kind of disasters. In this case, led to the death of at least 70 young women. And this is, I hate to say this, but this is going to get worse because climate change is coming on strong, and we have left ability now to deal with the impact. Okay. Okay. This is really tragic. Uh, more than 70 young women died as a result of this tragedy. And it just shows that climate change is a major issue in the life and death of Americans, and despite that, the president is making severe cuts in the efforts to fight climate change and also to cope with the impact of climate change in terms of cuts to the National Weather Forecasting Service, in terms of cuts to disaster assistance. So we've got a real problem here, which the present administration seems to be indifferent to. But hopefully next year, uh, voters will stand up and be counted and give Democrats back a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, and maybe even in the U.S. Senate, so we can begin to rebuild some of the carnage that the president has created. Uh, Bob, climate change is more and more of a problem, as we found out the hard way in Texas. But now we have less resources to fight climate change, less resources to cope with these disasters. What's your take on this?
No, it's a heartbreaking situation. What we saw in Texas this week, it's unfolding. It's just it's very sad. It's very tragic. Um, Nobody wants to exploit a tragedy like this, but look, the reality is this White House came in and deliberately put our eyes and ears out and undercut our ability to see over the horizon and to predict this kind of disaster. And we saw a faulty forecast as largely as the consequence of that. This administration has deliberately undercut the Federal Emergency Management Administration's resources, so we have fewer resources to cope with the aftermath of a disaster like this. And this administration is deliberately undercutting our ability to mitigate against the impacts of these kinds of things. This was a 1 in 1,000 year storm. What happened, which we know, is that we had 22 inches of rain dumped on the Texas Hill Country at a time from a storm that people were predicting would bring maybe a quarter of that much. And so it is exactly the wrong time to be retreating in the face of the climate crisis. These mounting dangers and growing costs are real. They're impacting every community in the country, and the people who are undercutting our ability to predict these disasters, to cope with their consequences, and to mitigate their impact going forward have to be held to account, Brad.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry to say this, but we are now in the season where we have extreme weather. These floods in Texas, will be hearing about wildfires in California and the rest of the western part of the country. There'll be tornadoes in the nation's midsection. Again, Trump is basically punting on the fight against climate change. And I'm sad to say there are going to be a lot more disasters like this. And I guess my question here is, do you think this is enough for Americans to stand up, especially before the midterm elections next year, and demand that Trump uh, fights the war against climate change, or is he just going to keep cruising with grave indifference to human suffering?
Well, Brad, that's going to be on us. That's on we the people. But here's what we know. Last year, the Union of Concerned Scientists documented that every single community in this country was impacted last year by dangerous heat waves, heat domes, the kind of raging wildfires you talked about earlier, hurricanes, storms, drought decimating our agricultural heartland. every community in the country has been impacted by this. More than 70% of the public understands we need to do something about it, and people understand what that is. It's not a mystery. We need to phase out our reliance on the dangerous fossil fuels that are driving this crisis and replace it with cleaner, cheaper, smarter ways to power our future. Unfortunately, what the Republicans voted last week, and let's be clear about it, not a single Democrat supported this, but
We're
the
we're
Republicans
gonna
voted
talk
to pull
about
the
that
rug
budget
out from under.
bill after the break. Our guest in this half hour is Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council. We're going to be back to talk about the environmental cuts in Trump's big bad budget bill right after this break. So don't go anywhere with more of Deadline. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour is Bob Deans, who is Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob, we've heard a lot about the cuts in the big bad budget, especially about Medicare cuts, which will, sadly to say, cause many people to die, cuts in food programs, but talk about the cuts in the budget for environmental and clean energy programs.
Sure, Brad, and you have to begin where you did. This bill is going to throw 12 million people out of health care to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. Who voted for that? It's going to add more than $4 trillion to the debt at a time when investors and markets are flashing red that we're headed over a fiscal cliff. Who voted for that? And of course, it's going to pull the rug out from under the fastest growing sectors of our economy, the clean energy segment that has generated well over 120,000 jobs and more than $130 billion in investment just in the past 3 years. Who voted to put a stop to that kind of manufacturing renaissance across this country? And so here's the impact, Brad. We're going to see federal incentives worth some $450 billion over the coming decade are being pulled out from under efforts to build factories across this country to build solar panels and get us in the game for the $2.1 trillion global clean energy market. We're going to see electric cars more expensive for low income and middle income drivers. We're going to see it more expensive for somebody to put a rooftop solar system on their home, save their electricity cost, or put in a heat pump or otherwise make their home more energy efficient. These are real costs for our families. But importantly, Brad, this is going to slow down. It's not going to stop, but it's going to slow down the cheapest, fastest growing, cleanest source of new electricity in the country. Wind, solar, and battery storage are accounting for more than 90% of all the new electricity capacity that's coming online across the country this year and last year, Brad. These incentives, what the Congress has done is to make all of that more expensive. Why on earth would you do that rocketing to feed these industry? It's a self-inflicted wound. It makes no committee hearings, no deliberation, no normal order, and no effort whatsoever to reach across the aisle and reach compromise.
Hey, Bob, we've got to take a short break to bring back our radio listeners. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and our guest, Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council, right after this break. And we're going to continue to talk about the danger of Trump's assaults against the fight for climate change. And we are also going to discuss the political impact when we get back from this very quick. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. and welcome back to our radio listeners. And to our late radio listeners, if you want to watch Deadline DC with Brad Bannon as well as listen to it, and you want to see the best in aggressive, progressive, must see online TV, you can watch us at twitter.com/Brad Bannon, at facebook.com/Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos, and at youtube.com/at Deadline DC. Our guest again is Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob, do you think these cuts are going to have a political impact next year in the midterm elections, or is Trump's going to be able to waltz through this like he does a lot of other big fatal flaws?
Brad, I don't think you can escape accountability on this one. And the American people understand that we have a climate crisis. They understand that when you pass um, legislation and take executive actions, they're going to result in an extra 500 million tons of climate pollution a year, 7% more. They understand that that has consequences, and it's going to have consequences in people's attitudes. People expect our government to manage crises, not manufacture them. And people are going to be stepping up. They understand what they're seeing out their kitchen windows, what they're seeing on their farms, their ranches, their communities, their churches, their schools. And people are going to stand up to this assault. Let's remember when this administration took office, we were on track to cut climate pollution 45% by 2030. That goal has now been put out of reach. People say elections have consequences, right? But there's a difference between consequence and catastrophe. This is not going to go down well with people. And it's not going to go down well, Brad, in the communities. 68% of them, red communities, Republican communities, where people are going to be losing jobs when factories shut down because people are not getting the support they had hoped for and banked on, frankly, for the clean energy revolution that's been remaking the manufacturing sector in communities across this country, Brad.
Let me ask you about my theory about this. Joe Biden left office as a very unpopular president. My theory is that historians are going to treat him more kindly than the current electorate does, because he began the fight against climate change, which is, I think, going to become more of an issue over time, unfortunately. And he also took great steps to integrate our economy with environmental concerns. Do you buy that?
What I buy here is this. I think the work of journalists like yourself has never been more important. And that's because a large and growing segment of the country has chosen to live in an environment of complete misinformation and disinformation. You cannot govern a country like that. We need to return to a point where most of the electorate, the bulk of us, are driven by reason, by facts, by evidence, by experience, by what is actually happening and what makes a difference, and not by a bunch of nonsense, not frankly by a bunch of misinformation and outright lies, Brad.
How do we get there, though, Bob? I mean, you're right about everything you said, but how do we get there?
It's a challenge. I think it needs to begin in our households and our workplaces where we influence the people we can. And we need to respect other people, but we also need to respect facts and we need to respect experience, what has worked and what hasn't. We've now had 4 experiments, if you will, since the Reagan era on this so-called trickle-down economics. And we now know beyond any reasonable doubt that when you give a $2,000 tax break to a carpenter who's making $80,000 a year, that $2,000 goes directly into the economy. When you give a $200,000 tax break to a billionaire, it goes in the bank. Those are different things. And so we've had experience with this. We know how this is going to pan out, but we didn't have a debate on it. We didn't discuss it. That's what we need to get back to, Brad.
Uh, we've talked about the cuts in environmental programs because of this big, ugly budget bill that just became law. But there are been a lot of other Trump actions by executive order that have done great damage to the environment. Could you talk about what you think are the most troublesome things that Trump has done environmentally or anti-environmentally since he was inaugurated back in January?
You bet, Brad. We have seen the worst assault in history on the environment and public health under this administration. And if you Google NRDC White House Watch, you will find we have compiled, we are documenting these actions. We have compiled, Brad, more than 240 actions or proposals this administration has taken to date that directly threaten the environment and public health. We're talking about the safety of our food and conservation on our farms. We're talking about water quality. We're talking about clean air. And of course, we're talking about threats to a climate safe future. It's all documented at White House Watch at NRDC, and your folks can go see it. More than 240 actions or proposals to date. We've never seen an assault like this, Brad. We're countering it with litigation where we can, and we're countering it in the courts of public opinion elsewhere. We're making sure people understand what's at stake. We're making sure people understand who's paying the price, and we're helping give people the language to speak up for their own selves, to hold our leaders to account for this devastating assault, Brad.
And we're proud to be part of that effort by having you here on Deadline DC, Bob. Let me ask you this question. Uh, we're now drilling more and more oil. You talked about the dangers of dependence on fossil fuels, which the Trump administration has completely ignored. We're opening up national conservation lands to economic activity. And is whatever happened, I mean, I think I remember Earth Day back in April. That was started by a Republican, Senator Dan Evans of Washington State, which is a very environmentally, or no, it was Gaylord Nelson, actually, who started Earth Day. Uh, what happened to Republicans who were environmental advocates? Richard Nixon, on his watch, signed all sorts of environmental legislation into law. What happened?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brad. I mean, Republicans do have a tradition here. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was the greatest
Yeah.
conservationist in our history. Dwight Eisenhower set aside the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge so that our future generations might know the natural splendor of this country as the first Americans knew it. Um, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. He got lead out of our gasoline. George H.W. Bush went after acid rain. Even George W. Bush, as we know, a Texas oil man, went to the said in a State of the Union address, we have a problem in this country. We are addicted to oil. He wanted to do something about it. So it's a very new thing that this has become what it has become. It's twisted. I don't think most Americans see environmental protections as a red issue or a blue issue. It's an issue for all of us who care about our children's future. And so that's what we've got to get ourselves back to. We've got to center ourselves, and again, this more rational approach to our politics that's desperately needed now, Brad.
Are there any Republicans like that left, or are they all Democrats now?
Well, I think we now have a party that's run on fear. And so the Republican Party, it's hard to know where anyone's principles lie. It's hard to know what organizing policies there are anymore, except for fear. And they're afraid of the president, and they do what the president says. That's not a functioning political party. We need to do better by this country.
Bob, thank you for joining us today again on Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. We're always glad to have you back on the show to talk about such a vital issue. I also want to thank our guest from the first half hour, Mavinti Quashie, who is the White House reporter for the Washington Examiner. And of course, I want to thank our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, for keeping the show running on time and making it stay online. Welcome. We'll be back soon with more of Deadline DC with the best and aggressive must see online TV. Thank you.